Brief audio sting for reformed thinking. Welcome to the deep dive. You sent us a serious stack of sources this week, all of them mapping out how Russia might, well, how it might actually halt its active invasion of Ukraine.
It's a huge question, one that's on everyone's mind.
It is. And today we are going to try and cut through some of the noise. The goal is to find the specific ways this conflict can stop based on the analysis.
And that's a key distinction. This isn't about prediction, it's about analysis.
Exactly. Our mission here is to define the end games. So we're not guessing when the fighting stops. We're trying to analytically define how it stops.
And more to the point, under what specific combination of pressures Russia's leadership might finally decide that continuing this very costly war is a bigger threat to their power than accepting an imperfect peace.
An imperfect peace. I think that's a good way to frame it.
Mm-hmm.
We all remember how this started. February 2022 was a maximalist dash for Kiev. The goal was to topple the government in days.
A plan which obviously failed spectacularly.
Right. And since then, the war has hardened. It's calcified into this grinding, hugely expensive war of attrition.
It has.
But here is the analytical hook, the why of this deep dive. The sources you sent argue pretty consistently that this invasion won't end with a single, sudden event, not with a change of heart.
That's right. The central idea that comes through in all the material is convergence. It's a powerful concept here.
Convergence, okay.
Moscow will only halt its active invasion when three distinct, powerful sets of pressures align. They have to combine.
So it's not any one thing, it's the combination.
Precisely. These converging pressures have to make continued fighting more dangerous, and specifically more dangerous to the survival of the existing regime than accepting some form of retreat or just a freeze.
So we're talking about a kind of triple threat that forces the decision. So what are those three drivers we need to focus on today?
Well, the sources lay them out very clearly. First, you have battlefield realities. That's the military barometer, what's actually happening on the ground. Second is the domestic political dynamics inside Russia. That's the regime's biggest constraint.
Their internal pressure gauge.
You could say that. And third, the wider international constraints. This is all the pressure from the outside world. To understand any plausible end state, we have to see how those three drivers interact.
And those interactions produce the scenarios for a halt.
Exactly. They combine to produce four possible scenarios for how this all stops.
Okay, let's unpack this immediately then, because before we even talk about how the invasion stops, it feels like we need to get a handle on what the word stop even means here.
Yes. That's the right place to start. A precise definition is absolutely essential for clarity.
Because when the analysts in these papers use that word, they aren't talking about one clean moment, like a treaty signing in a grand hall. They're talking about a wide spectrum of deeply messy, politically charged outcomes.
That's it, because stopping the invasion can range from an unmistakable military defeat on one end to a messy, decades-long stalemate on the other.
Like a festering wound.
In a sense, yes. The analysis defines three primary forms the halt could take, and each one has radically different consequences for both countries and, really, for global stability.
So let's start with the one that's, I guess, the ideal from a Ukrainian and international law perspective, but maybe the least likely, a full Russian withdrawal.
This is the most demanding outcome in every possible sense. It means the complete retreat of all Russian forces back to Ukraine's internationally recognized borders, the 1991 borders.
And crucially, the sources emphasize the scope here. This isn't just about the territory taken since 2022.
No, not at all. The territorial scope is key. It means leaving all territories captured after February 2022, plus the areas seized way back in 2014.
So we're talking about Crimea and the occupied parts of the Donbas region, everything.
Everything. A full and complete restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity.
Which sounds like a full restoration of sovereignty, adhering completely to international law.
Legally, yes.
Yeah.
That's what it would represent. But politically, for the Russian leadership, it's the most toxic option imaginable.
Why toxic? I mean, beyond the obvious loss.
Because of how it would be framed. Domestically, inside Russia, and internationally, it would be an undeniable, unmistakable, humiliating defeat. There's no other way to spin it.
Right.
And given the tremendous ideological commitment, the sheer amount of political capital invested in this special military operation, the sources argue that the current leadership structure finds this political cost prohibitively high.
So it's just not survivable for them.
It would be incredibly difficult to survive. which makes it the least likely short-term outcome unless there's some kind of sudden cataclysmic shift in the regime itself.
Okay, so if total defeat is the maximum demand, the far end of the spectrum, what does the middle ground look like? The compromise state.
That would be the partial withdrawal. It's often described in the analysis as the ambiguous halt.
Ambiguous how?
In this scenario, Russia pulls back from some occupied areas, maybe even significant territory that it's captured since 2022, but it retains control over strategically valuable areas it deems essential.
So, for instance, they might give up parts of Zaporizhia or Kherson.
But hold on to the land bridge to Crimea and Crimea itself, and perhaps the parts of the Donbas they held before the full-scale invasion.
I see. So it's Moscow accepting the failure of its initial Grand War aims, but preserving certain trophies or strategic assets.
That's the idea. It's a way to reframe the narrative.
That feels like a classic compromise designed purely for domestic political spin, doesn't it?
It is entirely about framing. From Moscow's perspective, this outcome allows them to claim a defensive success.
How so?
They could say they secured Russian speakers or protected strategic naval assets in Crimea or achieved a buffer zone. It allows them to construct a narrative of success, even if the initial goal of subjugating Kyiv failed completely.
And for Ukraine, what does that outcome look like for them?
It's deeply ambiguous, as we said. On one hand, they regain major territory and the intensity of active fighting goes down. But on the other, it requires them to formalize, or at least tolerate, some degree of permanent territorial loss.
It's an admission that Russia stops the expansion of the invasion, but gets to keep some of the gains.
A very bitter pill to swallow.
And that leads to the third major category, which shifts away from withdrawal entirely. This is the freezing of the conflict lines. This is stabilization, not resolution.
A very important distinction. The freeze is defined by a cessation of large-scale offensive action. The front lines harden roughly where they are when the fighting slows down, and Russia continues to occupy Ukrainian territory indefinitely.
So the invasion stops in the sense that tanks aren't rolling forward anymore.
Exactly. It stops because moving forward is just too costly for everyone involved. But the core political dispute, the question of sovereignty, is left entirely unresolved.
What's the specific mechanism that would formalize this kind of halt? A simple ceasefire feels way too fragile. The sources point to something more structured.
They do. They look toward an armistice. An armistice is significantly more structured than a temporary ceasefire.
Okay, break that down. What's the difference?
An armistice is a formal agreement between the belligerents to halt active hostilities. Crucially, it typically includes detailed rules about troop deployments, buffer zones, rules of engagement, and, very often, international monitoring mechanisms.
So it's a rule book for not fighting.
A very good way to put it. It is a tool for managing the military reality on the ground without addressing the political or legal reality of who owns the land.
And we've seen historical parallels for this kind of no war, no peace state.
We have. The most cited example, and for good reason, is the Korean Peninsula.
Right, the DMZ.
An armistice was signed there in 1953. 70 years later, the two Koreas are technically still at war. It's only the massive scale fighting that's halted, managed by that demilitarized zone and a whole book of rules.
And the analysis suggests a Ukrainian armistice would function in a similar way.
It would. The invasion stops because continued offensive action is deemed too dangerous or costly relative to the gains, even though the sovereignty claims from both sides remain entirely contradictory. It requires both Kyiv and Moscow to agree that maintaining the current imperfect line is preferable to risking more bloodshed.
So we have our spectrum of outcomes. Full reversal, partial reversal, or stabilization and freeze.
That's the landscape of possibilities.
Now we have to examine what forces are actually required to push Moscow toward any one of those three choices. And as you said, it comes down to the convergence of those three drivers. The central decision, as our sources note, is about regime survival.
It always is. The question is always, what course of action best ensures the people in power stay in power?
Okay, so driver number one.
Yeah.
This is the one most immediately visible to the public. Battlefield realities. The military barometer. When does the military situation get bad enough to compel Russia to stop?
It happens when Russia is forced to reassess the costs versus the benefits. This happens when its units are consistently stalled or pushed back while suffering. Well, suffering exceptionally high casualties.
So it's about the cost becoming unsustainable.
That's the core condition for a forced halt. They must be losing high-value equipment and trained personnel faster than they can possibly replace them. This is especially true for key offensive units.
You mentioned an unfavorable exchange rate in one of the papers. That's a critical piece of jargon we should probably unpack. What exactly is Russia losing that they cannot replace, making the cost of gaining, say, another 100 meters of ground too high?
That's a great question. It's about an unfavorable exchange rate of resources for territorial gains. It's not just about losing infantry, though. Those numbers are staggering.
So it's not just bodies.
No. The losses that truly matter from a strategic perspective are the high-value assets. Specifically, the loss of skilled, experienced officers and NCOs, the backbone of any army who cannot be quickly replaced by mobilized conscripts.
The institutional knowledge.
Yes. And then there's the hardware. Precision-guided munitions, which often rely on restricted foreign technology. High-value armored vehicles like modern tanks and infantry fighting vehicles. This kind of material attrition gradually wears down Russia's offensive potential to the point where sustained, coordinated campaigns just stop. They stop due to hard material limits.
So this attrition is the engine driving one of our scenarios, the forced halt by attrition. The war stops because they simply run out of steam, even if the government doesn't politically admit defeat.
That's right. The military machine itself forces the halt. The well runs dry.
Okay, now let's think about the other scenarios. What about the battlefield conditions required for a negotiated freeze?
That requires a slightly different battlefield signal. It requires a genuine stalemate.
What defines a genuine stalemate?
It's a situation where Moscow recognizes that even with its current resource flow, it can't launch major offensives without prohibitive, unacceptable losses. And on the other side, Ukraine is equally incapable of launching large-scale counteroffensives that could break through Russian lines.
So the line becomes militarily static. Neither side can move it.
Correct. And that creates the military condition for a political agreement to stabilize it. Both sides recognize that further fighting is futile, so they agree to freeze it in place.
And then, for the most demanding political outcome, a significant withdrawal, the battlefield signals must be, what, devastating?
They must be. For Moscow to even consider actively reversing its gains, they need to face the immediate reality of serious setbacks.
What does a serious setback look like in this context?
We are talking about losing key logistical hubs deep behind the current front lines, or facing rising vulnerability in strategic regions like Crimea, perhaps through successful long-range strikes that isolate the peninsula or destroy key military assets there.
So things that make holding the territory untenable.
Precisely. Such setbacks are the only thing that would signal to the regime that continuing the war risks a catastrophic, humiliating collapse later on. It forces a calculation where an ordered retreat now becomes the lesser of two evils.
So the battlefield really does signal whether time is running out for them materially.
It does. It's the physical manifestation of their strategic position.
But as you said, that pressure only matters if the regime feels it internally. And that brings us to driver number 2. The crucial pressure gauge of domestic political dynamics.
Yes. Our sources cite regime survival as the single most critical constraint on the decision to stop or to continue the invasion.
And the war is sold to the Russian public in a very specific way.
It is. It's sold domestically as a necessary defense against NATO encroachment, a recleansing of historical territory, a fight against Nazism. The narratives are varied, but potent. So the political cost of admitting defeat is enormous.
But that cost is constantly being weighed against something else.
It is. It's weighed against the domestic dangers of a prolonged war, things like mounting casualties being sent home to towns and villages across the country.
And more mobilizations.
Yes, repeated, unexpected mobilizations that can erode public patience. And, of course, the economic hardships that start to hit the average Russian family. Inflation, lack of access to goods, these factors gradually wear away at the fragile social contract.
It seems, from reading the sources, that the political elite, the insiders, are seen as a more immediate threat to the leadership than the general public. Is that fair?
That is precisely the focus of much of the analysis. The leadership must constantly weigh the symbolic cost of retreat against the real dangers of a costly stalemate that threatens economic stability and the loyalty of the elites.
The people who actually keep the system running.
The foundation of regime security. This is the core calculus. Does protecting the war's narrative still justify the risk of alienating the people who actually keep the power structure running? At what point does the war become a bigger threat to them than a loss?
And there's a quiet but corrosive pressure on the elite that was mentioned in the sources. Opportunity costs. That feels like a powerful nuance.
It's a critical point for a regime that's built on patronage. For the political and economic elites, the oligarchs, the regional governors, the heads of state corporations, resources that might have gone toward their favorite projects or guaranteed profits, or patronage networks for their own benefit,
All that money is now going into the military machine.
entirely redirected. And the longer the war drags on, the greater these lost opportunities become. This leads to a silent but pervasive elite anxiety about the long-term viability of the very system that maintains their status and their wealth.
So they start asking themselves, is the preservation of this war worth the destruction of my own business model, my own power base?
Exactly. And that's a dangerous question for the leadership.
This internal pressure points directly toward the possibility of a sudden, unpredictable political trigger. The sources call it the shock catalyst. It's not an outcome itself, but a trigger for the other scenarios.
That's scenario 4, a sudden internal political shock. This could be an elite revolt, a rapid reshuffle in the Kremlin, or a palace coup catalyzed by major military failures.
Like the Wagner Mutiny, but one that succeeds.
That's a good, if imperfect, example of the kind of fracture we're talking about. It often involves key figures in the security services, the FSB, the military high command, or powerful industrial oligarchs concluding that the current course is terminally damaging.
And then they act. They sideline or replace the leader.
Yes.
So what's the immediate calculation for a new leadership group that comes into power in such a shaky, unstable environment?
A new and likely very shaky leadership would see ending the active war as absolutely essential to restoring stability and legitimacy internally.
So they would need a clean break.
By choosing to present itself as a break with the costly, failed policies of the past, even if that means accepting a substantial territorial retreat, the new group fundamentally alters the political feasibility equation. It might allow them to negotiate for sanctions relief or some form of international rehabilitation.
And suddenly that makes a significant withdrawal possible, where it was unthinkable just a day before.
It could. The immediate need for legitimacy and stability can trump the need to maintain the previous leader's narrative.
Okay, so that's the internal picture. Driver number 3 shifts our focus outward. The wider international environment. The external constraints. How does the rest of the world force Moscow's hand?
The external environment dictates how sustainable the war is for Moscow, both economically and technologically. The primary long-term mechanism here is economic pressure.
Sanctions.
Yes, the sustained effectiveness of economic sanctions and export controls is crucial.
We've seen so many rounds of sanctions. Is there a specific aspect of these controls that the sources identify as the most damaging long-term pressure point?
It's not just about energy revenue, although that is significant. The analysis suggests the most damaging aspect is the restriction on Russia's access to high-end Western technologies,
What kind of tech are we talking about?
particularly microelectronics, specialized machine tools, and components needed for modern military production. Things for drones, for advanced optics, for precision munitions, guidance systems.
Stuff they can't make themselves, at least not at the same quality.
Right. And this forces the state into difficult trade-offs. They have to fund military production using inferior domestic alternatives, or they have to rely on complicated, expensive workarounds to get the parts they need. Both options gradually weaken their capacity to sustain high-intensity operations.
So the goal of the sanctions, from this perspective, is to make time the enemy of Moscow, to force them toward the conclusion that their military-industrial capacity is collapsing.
Precisely. The gradual compounding effect of sanctions pushes Moscow toward the conclusion that they are running out of the ability to fight a high-tech war, which further limits their potential on the battlefield. It's a slow squeeze.
But the sources also discuss how Russia's relationships with non-Western partners can dilute this pressure. Where are the workarounds most effective?
The willingness of certain non-Western partners, China, Turkey, some states in Central Asia, to engage with Russia provides crucial lifelines. China provides a lot of dual-use goods and components that can be repurposed for military use. Turkey serves as a diplomatic middleman and a major trade hub. If sanctions enforcement wanes, or if Russia successfully establishes robust third-party transshipment routes.
Your goods are funneled through smaller countries to obscure their final destination.
Yes, if that happens, the external cost of continuing the war decreases significantly for them.
And what about the military calculus from the international side? It's not just about sanctions, it's about the aid flowing into Ukraine.
That's the other side of the coin. It relies on sustained external support. Western states must maintain their political, financial, and military aid to Ukraine.
To keep the pressure up on the battlefield.
This aid ensures Ukraine remains capable of mounting counteroffensives and stabilizing the front lines. And that reinforces Moscow's perception that time is not on its side. If that aid were to falter, the battlefield realities driver would shift immediately in Moscow's favor.
And finally, there is the ever-present shadow of miscalculation. The fear of escalation.
The fear of escalation to a direct confrontation between Russia and NATO is always present, and it creates powerful incentives for restraint on both sides.
Incidents in the Black Sea or near Polish airspace.
Exactly. Incidents near NATO territory, missile incursions, aggressive maneuvers at sea, these constantly force leaders to pull back from the brink. This shared fear of a catastrophic miscalculation can, paradoxically, push both sides toward de-escalation or negotiation simply to manage that risk. It serves as an ultimate external brake on maximalist ambitions.
Okay, so to recap the core insight here, the active invasion stops when military frustration, rising domestic political risk, and this external isolation converge.
They have to converge to force Moscow away from expansion and toward accepting a stabilized, if imperfect, status quo.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We now take those three converging drivers and see how they combine into four specific scenarios for ending the invasion. And the sources say we need to look at how each one balances three critical measures: justice, stability, and political feasibility.
And these trade-offs force some very hard choices. As the sources note, the core tension is that the outcomes which are currently the easiest to achieve, the most feasible ones, are almost universally the least just and the least stable in the long term.
A pretty grim calculus.
It is.
Let's start with the one considered the most plausible in the near to medium term. Scenario 1, the negotiated freeze on current lines.
Its political feasibility is rated as high.
And why is that?
Because it requires the least public admission of failure from Moscow. It aligns perfectly with a stalemate situation on the front lines. Russia can claim victory by, say, securing a land bridge to Crimea and protecting the new boundaries of its annexed territories, even if its initial war aims were completely defeated.
So it's the easiest to sell at home.
It is.
But if this is so feasible, why are the analysts in these papers so critical of its long-term viability?
Because its justice score is rated low. It tolerates the ongoing occupation of sovereign Ukrainian territory. This leaves deep political, moral, and humanitarian grievances completely unresolved.
And the human cost of that.
Think about it. It normalizes the displacement of millions of refugees and the continued subjugation of those living under occupation. By tolerating this, it sends a highly ambiguous signal internationally about the true costs of aggression and the value of territorial integrity.
And strategically, this outcome is seen as fundamentally unstable. The sources call it a potential Minsk 3.0.
Exactly. Its stability score is also low. The sources warn that this risks creating an unstable arrangement that merely pauses the war. It doesn't end it.
It gives Moscow breathing space.
Critical breathing space to adapt its economy, work around sanctions, reconstitute its military forces, and deepen the integration of the occupied regions. The war is not solved, it's just deferred. It preserves the seeds of future conflict because the underlying political dispute over Ukrainian sovereignty is not settled at all.
They just wait for a more favorable moment to strike again.
That's the primary risk.
Okay, let's jump to scenario 3, forced halt by attrition. I want to clarify the distinction here. If the negotiated freeze is a political decision to stabilize the line, what is the attritional halt?
The plausibility is also considered high in the near to medium term, but for a different reason. It's because it requires no political agreement at all.
So no one even has to talk to each other?
Not necessarily. The war simply winds down because hard material limits manpower, equipment, money force offensive campaigns to cease. It is defined as an exhausted pause, which is imposed by military necessity, not political will.
So the difference is the mechanism of stabilization. The freeze has monitoring rules and a political commitment, however fragile. The attritional halt is just raw exhaustion.
Exactly. It's dictated purely by military economics, that unfavorable exchange rate we discussed earlier. Ukraine, backed by sustained Western aid, imposes steady, irreplaceable losses on Russian forces until Moscow is compelled to cease major operations.
But because it doesn't involve negotiation, there are no rules, no guarantees.
No mechanisms for long-term disengagement. It's a much more chaotic end state.
And what are the consequences for justice and stability?
Both the justice and stability scores are low, just like with the freeze. But you could argue the stability score is even lower.
How so?
The conflict remains fundamentally unresolved, chaotic, and dangerous. Russia may still occupy significant territory by default rather than by agreement. The risk of a sudden renewed conflict is incredibly high because there is no political commitment to peace. It's just a period of economic decay and latent hostility rather than a structured armistice.
Okay, now we turn to the scenario that achieves the highest measure of justice but demands the steepest price from Moscow. Scenario 2, a negotiated peace with significant Russian withdrawal.
This is the most demanding and, as we've said, least likely scenario in the short term. It requires the convergence of our three drivers to be at their absolute peak,
Russia must not just halt, it has to actively reverse its gains.
which means relinquishing territories it has formally annexed into the Russian Federation. That is an extraordinary symbolic and emotional cost for the leadership to bear.
But the payoff here, if it could be achieved, is genuine long-term peace and justice.
The justice score is high. This is the most desirable outcome for international law, for sovereignty, and for the protection of civilian rights. It offers the clearest possible deterrent message against future aggression.
Stability.
The stability score is also high. This scenario offers the clearest foundation for lasting peace because it's often tied to concrete security guarantees for Ukraine, perhaps NATO membership or equivalent bilateral defense commitments, which would credibly deter future attacks.
The analysts must specify what kind of massive shift would be required for this scenario to move from least likely to plausible.
It requires that major political and military failure convergence we talked about, intense combined pressure from devastating battlefield setbacks like Crimea becoming vulnerable or losing major logistical hubs, must combine with significant elite anxiety about the regime's long-term survival.
So the leadership has to be backed into a corner.
Only when the leadership concludes that continuing the war poses an imminent threat to their own existence would they accept the humiliation of a significant withdrawal. They would do it to ensure the continuity of their rule in the rest of Russia. It's a survival move.
Finally, we address scenario 4, the internal political shock in Russia. This is the true wild card, the unpredictable trigger.
And it is essential to categorize this as a catalyst, not an endpoint. It's an event, like a rapid palace coup or a major elite reshuffle, that suddenly and dramatically alters the political feasibility of the other options.
Especially scenario 2, the withdrawal.
Yes, the core political equation could change overnight.
We discussed that a new, pragmatic leadership might use a halt or a withdrawal to gain legitimacy and secure stability. But what are the risks involved in such a shock?
The risk is profound because the consequences are highly unpredictable. While a shock could lead to a swift, pragmatic settlement and a substantial withdrawal,
It could also go the other way.
it could also empower more radical or revanchist elements, groups who might see the shock as a sign that the previous leadership wasn't aggressive enough.
And if that happens?
If that happens, the war could intensify dramatically, at least temporarily. This would lead to moments of extreme danger, especially given the confusion in the chain of command of a nuclear-armed state. The process of political upheaval itself introduces extreme instability into the global environment.
Who are the elites that could trigger this kind of shock? The sources hint at specific segments of the power structure.
The analysis points to two key areas. First, the military command structure and the security services, like the FSB. They might view the war's strategic failures as a direct threat to Russia's overall security and to their own institutional prestige.
So a professional frustration boiling over.
You could see it that way. The second group is the oligarchic or industrial elites. Their motivation is different. They're primarily driven by the loss of access to global markets and capital due to sanctions.
So their wallets are hurting.
Severely. If that group believes a sudden political change could restore their financial stability, their motivations could align very rapidly with disgruntled military factions.
So whether the shock leads to peace or greater conflict depends entirely on which specific segment of the elite ultimately seizes power and what their primary goal is. Is it restoring financial access, or is it escalating the conflict to restore national pride?
A very dangerous and uncertain moment. So if we connect all these scenarios back to the bigger picture, the sources present a clear and I think quite stark analytical trade-off. The outcomes that are currently the easiest to achieve, the freeze or the attritional halt, are the least just and the least stable in the long term. They all but guarantee future conflict by leaving occupied territories and unresolved grievances on the table.
And conversely, the outcomes that align with international law and provide the clearest foundation for long-term stability, the significant withdrawal, require the biggest, most difficult shifts in military and political conditions. They demand an active, humiliating reversal of gains by Moscow.
And that reinforces the necessity of the convergence we discussed at the start. The invasion stops only when military frustration, rising domestic political risk, and international pressure align so completely that the leadership concludes that pressing on poses a greater threat to the long-term viability and stability of the regime than the political humiliation of accepting compromise or retreat.
So it's a decision rooted in self-preservation.
Entirely. It's not about strategy or morality at the end of the day. It's about survival.
So what does this all mean for you as someone observing the geopolitics of conflict resolution? If the most feasible way to stop the bloodshed immediately, this Korean armistice model, is often the most unjust, leaving the seeds of war for a later generation to sow, what standards should policymakers prioritize?
A very difficult question.
Is it better to prioritize the reduction of immediate suffering through a quick, messy freeze? Or should they pursue the most just outcome, accepting the risk that pursuing that justice means risking more intense violence in the short term to achieve a durable, principled peace? That is a strategic and moral calculus you should carefully consider as you review these materials. Thank you for sharing your sources for this deep dive.